Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. It goes without saying, our future is invariably tied into our youth. The values, knowledge, and skills they pick up and develop along the way end up setting the course for future generations. Another truism would have to be the fact that our world, as far as demands, challenges, and opportunities are concerned, is surely within a constant state of flux. What was once a must-have skill and ability 30 years ago could very well be less in demand now. And of course, the opposite applies, in that other abilities which were not overly considered critical years ago can suddenly take on new significance. And take the day and age that we're shifting into now, within the 21st century. The IT era is based less around physicality and more towards communicative competencies, as well as that of other soft skills. So, you would assume that we as a culture would be doing everything in our power to foster such new skills within youth. You'd think that mainstream contemporary educational systems and curricula are brimming with opportunities for children to increase their competencies in these areas. Well, sadly, this is far from the case. Education systems, as far as curriculum, focus, and approach, are much more closely aligned in structure to that of the early 19th century. That being said, there are outliers within the world of education which recognize such folly and are doing all that they can to better serve the needs of young learners, communities, and societies at large. On the show today, we have one such guest who is deeply passionate about these issues and will treat us all to some much needed perspective. All right, welcome to the show. So, Peter Phillips is a Bali, Indonesia-based educator and founder of the Open Flow Learning Center, an immersive and experientially oriented learning center for developing children. The staff at OpenFlow curate a daily organic design of how language, mathematics, and science are approached. The underpinnings of this are tied to the belief that children will arrive at these places as a natural consequence of their development and comfortable relationship with place and people. Emphasis is on developing children's values, attitudes, skills, and knowledge through notions of interconnectedness with nature and one another. And these foundations are applied and delivered through the basis of inquiry, STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics, and project-based learning. Further, the center prides itself on its integration with conservation organizations and communities across Bali. Now, Peter himself holds a Bachelor of Primary Education and a Bachelor of Arts in Elementary Education and Teaching from the University of Newcastle, and has had working experiences in both Australia and Indonesia. And he brings a diverse skill set through the numerous educational organizations he has helped to grow. From his experience within collectives of deep thinkers and dynamically creative people across marketing and content creation, Peter is well positioned to bring exponential change to the world of education, business, and leadership. He communicates beyond societal norms, bridging modern marketing with authentic storytelling and personal connection. So with all that said, Peter, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show. Hey, how are you doing?
Really well, Christopher. Thank you so much for having me. I love what you're doing with Life as a Podcast. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
The diversity, so it's nice to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on today. This is a topic that applies, to all of us, quite frankly, right? And concerns our youth and everything moving forward. I was really eager to speak with you about this because I greatly admire a lot of what you're doing as well, and the research on everything that you and your center stands for. It's just so intriguing. And if we can expand those conversations and allow more people to hear it, all the better. So yeah, I'm really excited to get into it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think there's a lot to cover, so let's see how we go, yeah?
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, why don't we just jump into it? I do have the first segment lined up, and it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. And basically, this is a segment, as my listeners will know, when I just read off a definition of the guest profession. I like to do it for a few reasons. One, it kind of brings everybody up to speed about what the guest does. And then sometimes, too, Wikipedia just nails it with its definition of what, how they define the job. And other times, it's just off. And then, quite frankly, I think as well, when we take on these positions, we put our own stamp on how we do things. And I think all of this added up just sort of, allows for an interesting discussion to kind of take place or, come about. So with that in mind, I do have you down here for an educator, and it is a very catch-all sort of definition, but
Mhm.
I'll just read that off, and within the context of all that you do, maybe you can comment afterwards. Does it sound good?
Sure. Yeah, sounds good.
Perfect. All right, here we go. Educator. An educator is a person who helps students to acquire knowledge, competence, or virtue. Teachers may provide instruction in literacy and numeracy, craftsmanship or vocational training, the arts, religion, civics, community roles, or life skills. Formal teaching tasks include preparing lessons according to agreed curricula, giving lessons, and assessing pupil progress. So there it is. Again, quite general, but first take, what do you think of that?
I think it's interesting. For me, the initial feeling that I have, or the response from that, is it's a little bit too constricting. It's a little bit too confining. Even using the word educator and then going straight into teacher or teaching, there's different connotations which come from that. And I like to think that educating or being an educator is much more broad than that. It's not just about defining curriculum areas. It's not just about defining outcomes. It's actually looking at the human being in front of you and saying, what do I know about them now? What am I yet to know about them? What are my curiosities, or what are the mysteries of that person? And where am I leading them towards in the journey that we have together? So I think that for me is a much more spot on definition of education, on educator. And that's kind of how I see myself in breaking free from that mold of teachers. And I know a lot of teachers are looking to kind of break free of that mold too, which I think is an interesting thing to expand upon later, perhaps.
Yeah, it sounds like the aspect or the notion of humanizing it a little bit more. Is that, if I don't know, that's what I'm kind of picking up from what you're communicating there. Is that, am I onto something there?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Definitely. It's the age of personalization and individualization. And any child, as many of the listeners and yourself would know, and myself as parents, when the child looks up at you and looks at you in this sense of awe and wonder about who you are as a person, whether you're a father or a teacher, that's a very important role to play in society. And to be able to hold back and actually say, well, let's see the genius of this individual unfold. Because within a system of 500 children or 50 children or 5 children, each one of them has an individual genius, just like each and every one of us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I think that definition, at least for me, when I'm kind of reading it off myself and even pondering it a little bit more deeply, it does kind of like harken back to what I was reading off of the bio, or speaking of the bio, in terms of early 19th century sort of education, almost like that factory line sort of approach, to just pumping out the knowledge, and the students are just there to be taking it on, and it was just a one-way sort of transaction in essence. Whereas things are shifting, things are different now, and our systems need to adjust as well. But you're right, I mean, this is probably something that's going to come up later in the conversation. So in terms of adding anything else to the definition, is there anything there, or is that probably the biggest one for you?
I think that's probably the biggest one, but also looking at when we're looking at as a teacher, there are so many things that you have to almost define and you're accountable for. So breaking free of that and looking towards the future, we're kind of saying, well, there's only a finite amount of things which you can measure. And we're really good at measuring things, and we're really good at, ticking the boxes and making sure that we see, where we've progressed from A to B, for example, or from grade 1 to grade 6. But what about the things that are very difficult to measure, like emotional intelligence or communication and, collaboration, and all of these other words which are so crucial for now in the 21st century? But these are the things, or the soft skills as developing human beings, that are going to go into very diverse places of work, that we need to look at in terms of, well, maybe those things kind of defy measurements a little bit. Maybe it's a continual growth cycle until we go to the grave, for example. And that's a life process. Education is a life process.
Yeah. No, well said. I think, the way this talk is lining up, even those early stages here, is quite compelling. It's quite fascinating. So I'm really excited to dive into a little bit more. Getting back to the actual, place of work, and you founded the Open Flow Learning Center. In terms of like a daily sort of, I don't know, workload for you, like what would that entail? I guess maybe if we could paint a picture here for listeners, what makes your place unique and different?
Sure. I think so if I can go off the back of today, because today's still going.
Yeah.
Today's been very much looking at lining up a lot of recording things that are happening. And we have a big focus on translating what we're actually doing, because we're kind of in that 2.5-year phase of growth where there's a lot of activity happening, and it's how you kind of condense that into interpretable sharings about what we're doing. So for example, this afternoon we did a project-based learning professional development with the team of educators, just refreshing those things and kind of cleaning our perspective and saying, well, let's have a little look at what we're doing now and remember why we're doing that. Remember, it's a process. We're not looking to finish the lesson in one day or 1 week. So today's been about professional development, lining up some marketing, some social media type things to start communicating, and meeting a couple of people about possible collaborations at the Learning Center. And yeah, parent visits coming along, checking out the Learning Center, and daily operations of maintenance and things like that. So for me personally, it's a super dynamic, diverse day from go to finish, which is really fantastic. So
yeah, most definitely. I'm sure you can derive a lot of reward from that. And yeah, well, I think like in the course of having this program as well, the people that I've been encountering, a lot of them, the more hats that they're wearing, the higher degrees of satisfaction they're getting from their jobs. Of course, at times there can be stressful moments, obviously, but it's these different challenges along the way that really kind of fuel them, and in a strange way, in a roundabout way, almost fuel them for their next job, which could be completely different than the one they've just completed. It's that sort of freshness to it. I would suspect that maybe that would apply to somebody like yourself and what you're doing.
Totally. I mean, just sitting down and having lunch with one of the kids today. So being able to actually take a breath and remember that connection is still an important part of the day, and to be able to sit with them and listen to them about their inquiry on they've been making some things in food science about pasta and what's the difference between pasta and noodles and spaghetti and all of these different things, talking to a 5-year-old. And them making all of these things. Well, I think they're the same, but they're a little bit different. And the conclusion was, yeah, they're the same, but different.
There you go.
Things like that, where you can apply that in so many different elements of your adult life. But, remembering that it is a place of learning first and foremost. And the children that we serve is, often unlock the keys to maybe some blockages in other elements of the workplace, or, things you might be struggling with as a professional.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in terms of, I guess, getting, kind of transitioning over to the children themselves in the curriculum and the program that you have in place there, again, I kind of alluded to some of these things when I was introducing you, but maybe you could just paint, a little bit clearer of a picture than what I was able to provide. What makes your center unique from that perspective, from the perspective of the students, I suppose, or even the parents kind of viewing it?
Well, maybe I can start by saying that the amalgamation of what we are doing is really a consequence of many different educational philosophies, wonderful people from, the early 20th century, looking beyond that at human psychology and the evolution of human beings, looking at, educational philosophers like Rudolf Steiner, Maria Montessori, the Reggio Emilia approach, and really picking those beautiful golden threads, which are all centered around unlocking the potential of children and human beings. Because in the very, very foundational years, if we have a wonderful place in order for children to flourish, then the possibilities are endless. And so for us at Open Flow Learning Center, it really is, I guess, holding on to a common evolutionary thread through education that we've grasped in the middle of the pandemic in 2020. And myself and my colleague, Dr. Nicolene, who we work closely with, to be able to unite our geniuses and to say, well, here's a wonderful approach, and with the families that have come along, and we'll be able to bring education forward into a different age. And, out of that movement, I'm not saying it's negative or it's a wrong way of doing things, but it's complementary. This is complementary. This is, you can also do this. So it's not putting ourselves in segregation and saying, okay, we have a little island and it's wonderful paradise here. Like Bali actually is a wonderful paradise. But it is saying, yeah, we're an island, but there's many ships which come along. There's many planes flying over. There's wonderful, wonderful things happening around the world. So this is our contribution to a shift in educational consciousness, if you like.
Yeah. Okay. I see. No, well said. All right. Well, I would like to kind of continue this back and forth and maybe shift over into a new segment here if we could, Peter. A Q&A discovery, basically. And this first question here, I kind of want to return back to you a little bit here. I mean, listeners love the backstory and how people sort of evolved in their professions. And I understand that, you've got a lot of your education while you were in Australia, and eventually made your way to Indonesia and into Bali in particular. But maybe you could shed a little bit more light on the connection there between those two countries and what ultimately led you to founding, the school that you have now.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, my heart kind of lies here, talking about the evolution of generations and people. So if I can start there, my mother is Balinese, and our heritage goes back generations and generations on the same block of land, if you like. So part of the Majapahit dynasty from India, flowing all the way through down into southern Indonesia, to the East Indies, and eventually landing in Bali. So for me, that's a wonderful, wonderful memory to hold on to, because I don't know what that is like. I don't know what that evolution of my forefathers and grandparents and great ancestors went through in order for me to be here. Yeah. So it's the same on my father's side, who's Australian. So really being curious about that, and ultimately leading to it's curious about myself and who I am. I kind of, as you said, grew up in Australia and worked in Australia and didn't go to university till I was a bit later, 24 years of age, and had to do a bridging course to get into university because I basically dropped out of high school and did creative subjects like photography and all things like that. And then eventually fell in love with education and being with children and the profession itself, which led me to a Rudolf Steiner school, or a Waldorf school. And I was there for 8 years, and I worked as a class teacher. And in that system, you actually take your class from a grade 1 and you follow them through until grade 6 or grade 7. Okay. And that was just incredibly eye-opening and heart-opening and mind-opening, that evolution of progression in the children. But if I can be a little bit more selfish, in me as a person and a professional, if you like, was just totally life-changing. And the beautiful aesthetic quality in which an education system like Waldorf education has in the arts and performance space and so on. So that really started to, I guess, channel where I was coming, and then eventually finished up there, and I came over to Bali, and I worked in a quite prestigious school over here for a year and a half, and then COVID came, and then even before then we had set the initial steps of founding Open Flow, as I said, with my colleague Dr. Nicolene, and then that was the huge catalyst that we had. And so now I could not have planned this, and it was not on the horizons. And just listening to yourself earlier about being there for 20 years and after the year planned trip, and that kind of makes me a little bit scared about, okay, maybe this is 20 years, but also very excited at the same time. So that's where I think a lot of other factors, if you like, come into account, but really like starting to lay some roots here and say, well, there's some wonderful, wonderful things we can do in a place like this and contribute back to community and family here also. Because the basis of our educator team is Indonesian too. Okay. All right. No, thanks for sharing that. In terms of, I guess, the approach, your educational approach, obviously you just sort of like speaking of your past experiences probably influenced that to a certain degree. I'm wondering as well whether it was, part of this general sort of, I don't know, it's almost like a malaise that a lot of people are starting to develop or feel towards like the traditional form of education right now, which again, is kind of harkening back to early 19th century in its approach and almost like factory-like efficiency that it was built to kind of produce.
And in speaking in this conversation already, we've recognized that, children probably don't benefit from that approach necessarily. Maybe they did back in those days, but not right now. It just doesn't fit the day and age that we're living within. Was that also kind of a catalyst for, deciding to move forward and start your own school?
Absolutely. I mean, if I can say that, a hint of rebelliousness comes out in me as an educator, and with all respect to the people that I've worked with and mentors and so on, a lot of the huge learnings for myself have been in what not to do. And I think that's really, really interesting as a personal, professional reflection. Out of associating with other people, out of developing an emotional intelligence to work collaboratively with other people, and to understand that diversity is extremely key in any workplace, just as it is in a family, to be able to take those things and say, well, okay, I understand the intention behind that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to try it differently. I'm going to try it unique to my way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
And that very much, bring that back to the children, going back to your question, is they don't know a lot about the world that we know about the world. So what I mean by that is we've gone through a whole period of time and had that traditional education. We see the similarities of where education was when we were at that age and where parts of it still are now. Yeah. And a considerable amount of time has changed there. And the evolution of children and child development and media and all sorts of different factors which come into account makes that shift or that gap really, really, really obvious. And that right there was the point of entry, if you like. Well, let's bring the little tribe that we have, if you like, or those families that were really aligned with wanting something different, who are really intrigued by that and holding a space for their children to experience something else. And then inevitably and eventually entrusting you with that. And that's a huge responsibility, whether it's one child or 35 or 40 children or 500 children. It's the same principle throughout. It's just harder and much more challenging to maintain that quality, if you like, that level of quality if you have a school of 500 children and you have to manage the adults and so on. So this micro lab school setting, it's okay, the issues are here coming from the people. We need to sort it out in a wonderful, wonderful way, which is growth.
I like that. And I really like that point that you raised about, recognizing the fact that the day and age that we're living in right now is very much different than what it was in the past. And there's all these different contextual layers that are in there that influence, how children are brought up into this world, essentially. And what is best for them now is certainly going to be probably different than what it was back in the day, right? So it would seem kind of silly or, almost crazy, dare I say, to kind of like hold values from a previous time to a generation now with all these different, contextual influences that are, rearing their heads. It would make sense to recognize some of the challenges that children face right now and build systems that are going to allow for, the right kind of development to take place. I think of things like technology and all the influences there and distractions and smartphones and different things like, connecting to nature, connecting to the world, the physical world around them, letting them explore it, rather than being drilled into their heads and studying out of textbooks. I mean, if there's opportunities for real life learning experiences, that's what they're sort of craving anyway. So if we can find ways to allow for this sort of natural curiosity to take shape, it would seemingly, allow for learning opportunities to flourish. So I really
totally.
like that point.
I just want to pick up on one thing you said there, Christopher, about education systems. And when you really look at that, so just, ask yourself a question, what is an education system? Okay, but inevitably within that system, you have human beings who are operating the system. So we're talking about educators, coming back to your initial Wikipedia definition, educators. This is something which also we need to focus a lot more on in terms of educator development. How you assist educators to better understand the developing child, better understand the power of questioning, the better understanding of allowing time and space to live in that world of imagination and curiosity and inquisitiveness, and allow them to have their energetic spirits and allow them to be simply them, because they have their nuances. And we know this with the state of the world, mental health, all sorts of things that almost in if I dare say it, pandemic proportions, which are just rife around the world, and people are putting their hands up and saying, okay, we need to teach the kids better. We need to teach them this class. We need to teach that class. Well, let's just take a backward step and say, if we foster that environment through educators, living that or imbuing themselves with that archetypal human being of truth, goodness, beauty, integrity, all of those characteristics, then wow, what a world that would be. And there, I know ideals may not be, may not ever be realized, but they're definitely worth striving for.
100%, 100%. Maybe to kind of highlight what you guys are doing and in terms of the difference. I mean, again, like I had the privilege of being able to visit your website and just seeing some of the imagery of the school itself, the physical surroundings of your school, how it appears, how it's built, how it's different than, again, a traditional school. Maybe you could share with listeners a little bit more about that. How is your school different from a physical standpoint, but then also from a curriculum standpoint as well? If we could lightly sort of get into it. I know we're
sure. Well, physically, if I was to paint a picture for you of walking into the school or the learning center, you wouldn't know where to start because there's no fences, because there's very, very few enclosed structures. So why is that? And initially we would have some parents come along and say, oh, wow, it's such a beautiful environment. We love the banana and coconut trees and it's so tropical Bali, but where's the classrooms? And I would say, well, at the moment we're standing under a super, super beautiful one. It's about 200 years old. It's a type of teak tree. And if we go down a few hundred meters down the stairs, then we're sitting at the river, which has been flowing since the eons of time. So my point is, and you see this in architecture also. How do you invite nature into the space? So these biophilia or biophilic principles. How are you not segregated from nature, where you go out to the garden, where you're in the garden. You're in the world classroom. You're in nature. The biomimicry teaches us, if we look at nature in a particular way, those fundamental principles, or how collective colonies of ants work, or the collective intelligence of bees, all of these principles we can take if we immerse our children in nature. Because this awakens almost inexplicitly, it awakens their capacities to think and critical think and problem solve and question and become curious about the world. And that's the true gift of nature, which adults have to relearn or remember. So what does that mean? When you remember something, you are becoming one again. You're becoming one with your childhood memories again. You're going back to that time and place where you can smell, taste, remember that light shining on your face. And these are the embodied memories, which unlocks neurologically wonderful pathways in the neurological system. So that's largely the reason of creating a very minimalistic built structures and immersing ourselves in the environment.
Yeah, I love that. Also, again, in researching, for this talk, I did see on your website something called the 4 pillars approach to education. And perhaps you could fill listeners in on what that means and how you pragmatically go about, and teaching those things, those values.
Yeah, I mean, our 4. So again, coming back to, I love looking at architecture principles and all different methods to make sense of the world, if you like, and to be able to translate in the way which my mind kind of sees these things. So the 4 pillars are upholding the rest of the structure. You have your foundations, yes, which are the human beings, I believe, in an education system. And then these 4 pillars are very much the philosophies, if you like. So if you take if I go in an order of inquisitive minds is one of them. So if you watch a 2-3-year-old, well, if you go even further back than that, you remember when your children were crawling on the ground, go further back than that, when your child first realizes that their limbs come past their face and they're enraptured by that movement, and then all of a sudden it's gone, they don't know where it is because they don't have the proprioceptive movement to understand yet. So that is naturally in us, to be inquisitive, right? So nature teaches us to be inquisitive. So acknowledging and honoring the inquisitiveness of each and every individual. That's not a linear, that's not a compartmentalized thing where we can put a child in this box, that box. There's a whole spectrum, and probably yet to see in future also. So then that moves into curiosity and motion, right? It's not a stagnant curiosity. This is trial, test, project-based learning, question, all these different things. So we apply those curiosities, and then that moves into energetic spirits. So what we mean by energetic spirits is, well, you bring something wonderful to the table with your temperament and your ideas and your knowledge and your thinking, just as someone else who maybe doesn't, voice their opinion as much. Maybe we need to listen. Maybe we're learning how to listen better. So within your energetic spirits, your energetic beings, we realize that we're a fluctuation of energies of, introversion and extroversion, and all the different, spectrums in between, which leads to simplicity in being. And that is, there is only one, there will only ever be one of you, ever. And that's a phenomenal concept to actually think about.
Yeah,
For anyone that sits in front of us, wow, the simplicity in being you is already genius.
Yeah.
So if I take a step back and ask you a question, or really listen to you, or observe you and get to understand you better, then I'm going to have to unlock capacities in myself.
Yeah.
And if I'm genuinely seeking that as an educator in education, then the possibilities are going to open up before me. So those 4 pillars are very almost philosophical, but they're very rooted in almost, energetically embodying those things in everyday practice.
And I love that too. I mean, I think at this point now, I'm sure listeners are getting a much clearer understanding of what separates, say, an education system that you're developing or you have developed, as opposed to what's currently, mainstream right now. And it's such a different approach, And I think too, it's probably becoming quite clear as far as the value of a system like this, of what you're promoting, and the value that it can provide to children specifically, how they can handle the world, how they can interpret things within the world, how they can interpret relationships amongst one another. And again, these are things that are these soft skills that I alluded to off the top too, that I think are becoming even more critical, with each passing day. I mean, the world that we're living on, again, is this information technology age, right? And it's all about communication. It's all about how we interact with one another. And if we don't have the skills, if we're not imbuing these sort of skills within our children, then how can we expect to have, this bright, shiny future for ourselves moving forward? So yeah, I really, really appreciate that approach. And I really appreciate those comments on that. As far as the children themselves, I mean, probably, you can add these things up and get an idea of what the children, or how the children are benefiting. But I think it'd still be worth hearing, like, what are you seeing in the children as they develop, as they age and go through some of these programs that you're setting up? What are you observing in them?
There's one parallel which we observe very quickly in the short term and also in the long term. And that is the power of the opportunity for them to have a voice and to have a choice. Okay, so we've found this in children that have been at the Learning Center coming from all sorts of different traditional systems, or alternative schooling, all sorts of different backgrounds. And we've found over the first few days that, our reflection question is, well, how are you finding the space? Or even just observing in the sharing circle, I really like how I get to choose. I really like how I get to say what I want to do in parts of my day. So the evolution of that, which we've seen in some children that have been with us for 2.5 years, is that now talk about personalized learning for themselves, talk about activating themselves, talk about looking at their curiosity and saying, okay, there's possibilities. Why? Because knowledge lives everywhere. I don't have to know everything as a teacher. We can tap into all sorts of amazing physicists online through online courses, all sorts of MOOCs, massive online courses. Knowledge lives everywhere now. But the online space cannot teach the values, skills, and attitudes as effectively as this. And that's where the true power is, in realizing first. So again, there's always so much focus on the children and the kids, but realizing this as an educator, as a teacher, as a principal, as a board member of a school, realizing that it's actually investing time, energy, space in educators and teachers remembering, reuniting, going back, actually, physically going out into nature, role playing these things and sharing circles and professional development on those things, which is really, really exponentially key. Because I can talk about, 1 or 2 children or 15 children here, but what happens if you talk about 15 educators and applying these principles with 15 educators? Then you have multiplied by 20, 30 per classroom, and then you have exponential change.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, I mean, as an educator, it would just again, kind of listening to all of this, it must be incredibly rewarding for them as well to be contributing to an ecosystem such as this. I mean, just the rewards that they'd be deriving, from a sort of selfish standpoint of just like what they're learning constantly and what they're getting out of it, aside from what they're giving. If you're trying to develop a system where it is symbiotic, I mean, that's the best of both worlds right there, is that right, where you feel like you're almost getting something out of this by just giving, giving and teaching and educating, but you're also deriving a lot from it as well. I mean, that's the best. That's certainly what I'm sure anyone would be striving for.
Yeah, but I can also say the underlying truth behind that, which is just below the surface. It doesn't take much for it to come out, Christopher. It's just like just there, is that it's so incredibly challenging. If you are set in your craft, if you've had a certain amount of experience, if you've been brought up in a system like that, if you've gone through high school, university, and then you are empowered with the freedom to really be yourself. Freedom comes with responsibilities.
Yeah.
And what responsibility means is I have to learn what my capacity and my ability to respond to things are. So, as educators, team members, it's extremely confronting at times too, to really look back and say, hang on, there's a lot of projections in what I'm saying about behavior of children, or in terms of time management of myself, or maybe the school, or Pete isn't giving me enough time to plan. Well, let's just unpack that a little bit. So where's your responsibility as the adult in that, as the professional also? So that can be quite confronting at times, and I think that's a good truth to kind of just put a line in the sand there and say you have to want to cross that also. And if you cross that, then it's a wonderful, wonderful path of, I guess, self-realization, which helps you in many parts of your life. But it's a hugely if I say it's a process of metamorphosis.
It sounds like it. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of philosophical sort of or juggling around of ideas essentially, and trying to rebalance things, I suppose, as an educator. Yeah, and
absolutely.
And again, it's a developmental sort of projection. It's just little by little. It's not going to happen overnight, obviously. So it's a process, no doubt. All right. Well, it's been a really interesting discussion thus far. And I think we are heading into this water cooler story segment here, which for guests, it's basically where I just ask them to indulge listeners with a story relating to their profession. So I'd really love to hear what you have for us today, Peter.
Yeah, well, I think I like hearing what's living. And this is currently what's the history of becoming an educator and moving over here and founding a learning center in the middle of the pandemic, and all sorts of uncertainties, and even to the point of being 2.5 years in what is essentially a startup also. And having those, I don't know what other people and listeners I'd be interested to hear, but I'm constantly questioning myself. And what I mean by that is, I'm not even talking about a self-confidence or something. I'm constantly questioning, okay, am I aligned with myself and how I see the world? Am I aligned with what I initially set out to do? Am I too far at the front that I'm not allowing space for other people to be in front and to listen to other ideas? Am I too, constantly keeping myself in check and questioning those things as a founder, and also, my responsibilities with families, and to make sure that it's a financially responsible place with all of the team here and staff here, because, they have children and they have families, and, all of those different responsibilities, and driving the marketing and driving the engagements with potential partners and so on like that, which is a huge task. And I can honestly say that sometimes I get so exhausted and I really just kind of have to sit And I do. I have a sitting chair and I go, okay, just like lock out the world for a minute and just let me get into my world and let those things, as what you said before, just let those things kind of sink into their spots. That I'm okay. I'm breathing. I'm healthy. My family is healthy. The world is not collapsing. It's just my mind getting the better of me. So for me, in making sure that if I need to be my optimal best, then I know my surroundings will be too. If I'm peaceful and harmonious and clear and all of those different qualities in myself, then I'm going to exhibit that. If I'm totally here like this and I'm walking around like this, then that's going to come everywhere. So taking on that responsibility, and in my house there's no mirrors, but always constantly keeping myself in check and how I'm not walking around, or because I could be deep in thought, but someone could interpret it in a way.
Right.
So it is for me just a wonderful process of controlling myself as a developing human being also, and knowing that growth is exponential in the 2.5 years, and the amount of things I've had to do that. Thinking about coming from a teaching background, well, I think I've come through all sorts of intense learnings and workings of other areas of work, which are so incredibly valuable as a life process, because I found that now I'm really able to help other people. Now other people are able to say, hey, what's your perspective on this? Okay, let's talk. I don't have the answers, but I'm really happy to listen.
I think that's what it's all about, really, at the end of the day, in any profession, whether it's within education, whether it's within business, whether it's in entrepreneurship, it's that constant growth. It's that constant sort of recognizing where you are in a particular moment, but then having, sound enough mind and reasoning to kind of step back and at least observe, maybe some of the healthy thoughts or ideas that are floating through your mind, and some of the ones that aren't as constructive or helpful, and finding ways to kind of manage those emotions and whatnot. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is how well you can kind of navigate that. But it sounds like, to me at least, again, just from an outsider's perspective, it sounds like you have a good handle on it. And it's hats off to you. I mean, 2.5 years of starting this, and wearing several different hats, it sounds like, from the educator standpoint, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, from a few different other standpoints as well, I'm sure, in there, that it is a challenge, but it sounds as though you have the right mindset, though, at least it would appear, at least. So
well, I think just looking at it in terms of paying attention to what it is happening now. And I could be a million different places in my imagination. I can be in an infinite amount of places in my memory, but ultimately I'm here at this point in time. So what do I actually have to do now, outside of myself, but through myself, in order to move things along? And then that will shift the future possibilities too, and maybe even rewire some of that, things that we're dragging from behind us, if you like.
No, well said. I think that's gonna be really helpful for a lot of listeners, again, regardless of whatever they're doing in their own lives, professionally speaking. So that was really nice. Well, I would like to shift into our last segment here, a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're usually looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And I did see this insightful video of you, again, on your website, speaking about how you personally got started and how you ended up on this path. We kind of covered this a little bit today. And in terms of how you discover these gifts of an independent form of education and what it can bring. And again, we've kind of touched on this already, but here's the question in terms of the segment: how do you see this sort of, this sector evolving, basically these independent forms of education that aren't mainstream? I mean, how optimistic are you of this becoming bigger, it catching on, it maybe, clawing a little bit into the mainstream somehow, some way? Do you think we're going to see some full-scale changes eventually, or is that still a ways off?
I think 100%, if I can go that far already. If I think about how technology is actually truly changing the face of the world in terms of decentralization, and if we think about that in terms of education, independent forms of education are actually decentralized forms of education. And if you go to something like, briefly go to something like NFTs, for example, And there's been a huge kind of wave, and now it's kind of filtering out all the the money-making scams and all of that. But the software or the ideology behind that and what that can mean for real-world application is really, really fascinating. So you apply those things, and this is why I'm so curious outside of education, looking at things like the decentralization of finance, if you like, blockchain technology, the software behind that. So what do those principles mean for education systems? Well, it's the decentralization of education. And that's fantastic because you have, like-minded people from across the world where all of a sudden you have a network and you can be you. You can be your form of independent education and we can be our form of education, independent education, but there's a common thread there. And that is in serving the needs of the people who are in that place, because that's always going to be different. You mentioned this in the beginning of a place-based setting. There's different 2 kilometers away, let alone 2,000 kilometers away. So having that place-based approach to education, thinking about education in the future, what decentralization means, but through the realization of educators looking at education, teaching in a different way, through approaching child development and human development and possibilities in terms of projects and curiosities and all sorts of nuances that children bring, then you have wonderful, wonderful possibilities tied in with connection and the fact that knowledge is everywhere.
Yeah.
So I'm really, really, really super eager at shifting the trajectory or speeding up the pace a little bit. So how do you do that? Well, it's through communicating in different ways. And education typically, okay, I'm the principal of the school and and I'm not, by no means, I'm not disrespecting that. But education needs to move with this impulse of, it's not an authoritative point of view. The only authority is truth. And it's the truth of the human beings that you're serving, whether they're educators, whether they're principals, directors, children, families, parents, that's the truth. And when you look at that and when you meet in the middle, or if you hold that little magic space in the middle, if you draw this lemniscate picture where the intersecting part is right in the middle, you can also be in totally opposite ends of the spectrum, then you have wonderful, wonderful possibilities. So I'm really excited to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, I mean, that's the most optimistic tone that we could probably have right now and end on. So I don't want to go any further because I love that. I love all that sentiment and I want to bottle it all up and maybe just close it off right there. But I must say, I mean, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's just flown by. I can't believe we're already towards the end of it, but I'm sure listeners are really going to appreciate everything that you've shared today. So thanks so much for joining the show.
I appreciate you for facilitating, and I know the diversity of what you're sharing is, super important to someone like myself to hear from different sectors too. So the individuals that have been on, it's a diversity, just like biodiversity in nature, absolutely key.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, for those interested in learning more about Peter and his work, of course, you can check out his school, the Open Flow Learning Center, via their website. You can also find them on Instagram and LinkedIn. And for reference, all this information will be included in the show notes. And also, too, I mean, hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. It goes a long ways. And I think in the spirit of the discussion today, I mean, letting people know of different modes of education is so critically important to us, advancing the agenda of finally instilling some change that are going to be a benefit to youth moving forward. And of course, too, you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And also, if you have some time, head on over to YouTube. We did launch a channel over there within the last year. And we do have some videos of the conversations, much like we had today with Peter. And the interesting thing there is we will have some imagery associated with the talk. So you can kind of take it in a different manner. And then finally, don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.